Hurry up in the shower, we have to leave soon. I yelled towards the bathroom at my husband. Every year at some point in the days leading up to Christmas, our families get together. We were already making bad timing when he realized he needed a shower. I had misplaced my earrings, paranoid about making us even later. As I walked past the bathroom, I noticed the door wide open. My husband stood there, still naked from having recently departed the shower. He had draped a pastel orange towel over his head, one that I didn't even know we owned. It didn't cross my mind at the time, just a fleeting thought. He swayed gently from side to side, like a swinging pendulum. I giggled. Stop being silly, you know we're running late. Have you seen my earrings? Immediately upon entering the bedroom, I spotted them gently glistening on the bedside table. Relieved, I yelled again. Never mind, found them. As I put the first in, my gaze fell directly ahead of me, at the painting of a lighthouse hung on our bedroom wall. My husband was never a stranger to local markets. He almost had a talent for buying the strangest items. I've grown used to it, but this painting always stood out to me as a bizarre purchase. The lighthouse stands as the subject, with a series of indistinct, colorful blobs painted around the bottom. A crowd of nondescript people, I had always assumed. On the frame, at the bottom, a title or note or quote of some kind had been etched in. The Jolly Good Fellows. My trail of thought was cut short as I failed to get the second earring in. I had stabbed myself slightly and began to head to the bathroom for the assistance of the mirror. He was still standing there, swaying. Honey, we really need to go soon. Please get ready. I approached the mirror. Seeing no blood, I breathed a sigh of relief and put the second earring in. The whole time, from the corner of my eye, I could still see him swaying. The towel blocked any view of his head. My patience was wearing thin. Had he even sorted his clothes out yet? Honey, come on, I spoke as I lifted the towel from his face. Peering under, I expected to see him smiling, acting playfully. I felt a little bad, but being ever aware of the ticking clock, sometimes I have to remind him to have urgency, even when he's just playing around. His eyes were wide, his face emotionless. He stared forward as though there wasn't a wall a few feet from his face, like he was looking just a little past everything. He stopped swaying as the towel was removed, but remained in this state. I gently held his hand. Come with me, let's sit down. I knew something was wrong. As I guided him to the bed and sat him down, his arm felt limp, as though his muscles were void of any connection to the brain. Let's get you some clothes, okay? We can talk about what's wrong. I tried to speak calmly as I turned around and searched through the wardrobe. I began asking questions, trying to take his mind off of things. My mind, while still aware of the time, was now more focused on my husband's well-being. Noticing a lack of answers or responses, I turned back to face him. Have you ever jumped at the lack of something? Usually we jump at the sudden presence of something we were not expecting. Perhaps the sudden movement of an object we thought would remain motionless. But when I saw my husband wasn't behind me, my body jolted slightly. I hadn't heard him move or felt him walk past me. I expected him to still be on the bed. The lack thereof was enough of a shift to shock me. Honey? I yelled slightly, wondering where he was. I walked past the bathroom and there he was, orange towel draped over his head, swaying gently at the same rhythm as before. If you don't respond to me, I'm calling an ambulance. I needed a quick answer. My mind jumped straight to some form of brain injury, perhaps from falling over in the shower. I knew that acting fast is the only chance you have to minimize damage. He didn't answer. I removed the towel from his head as I dialed emergency services. Again, he stopped swaying. As I explained everything to them, I watched as he knelt down, picked the towel back up, and draped it back over his head. The swaying continued thereafter. Paramedics arrived shortly. He put up no fight and allowed them to escort him to the ambulance in a wheelchair. I kept asking questions about whether he'd be okay. They had to keep assuring me that whilst the hospital would do everything they could, they had no information to go off of. My racing mind looked past this and continued to ask similar questions regardless. He kept trying to stand up whilst en route to the hospital, yet would be compliant when gently pushed back down. As long as someone was guiding him, he would follow. When this stopped, would he try to move? The same had happened back home. He only got up and left once I had sat him down and let go of him. Through the sound of the sirens wailing overhead, the bumps of the ambulance's journey, and trying to hold back my tears, I could hear a familiar tune. My husband, showing almost no other signs of activity, was gently humming. I leaned in to get a better listen. It was a very low tone, and each note seemed to begin as a hum, yet end as more of a raspy breath. Each one seemed to continue for slightly longer than they were supposed to, but I recognized this tune. He was humming, "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Arriving at the hospital felt like a blur. Everyone knew exactly where they were going. I was following along, completely lost in this maze of signs and painted lines intended to guide. We had left the ambulance and arrived at his assigned bed before I could process what was happening. As soon as he was laid down, the confusing blur continued. "Ma'am, could we borrow you in the next room? We just need you to fill out some paperwork." "Not until I know if my husband is okay," I snapped. "We understand, but the best chance at survival is if we understand everything. This paperwork will take care of some of that." I was assured that a doctor would be in the room shortly, and that my husband was in good hands. I shouldn't have listened. They certainly didn't. I explained that he kept trying to get up and walk about, but they clearly underestimated. I hadn't even helped the lady fill out my husband's personal information before we were informed that he was missing. "He can't be far away. Keep an eye on all entrances." The staff spoke to each other urgently. I was asked to remain calm and continue helping with the paperwork, but I refused. I attempted to run around the hospital to join the search, but was quickly told that I don't have the authority to be wandering around alone. I hardly cared. My husband was the only thing on my mind, but I didn't want to be escorted out and risk not seeing him at all when he's found. I took my efforts outside the hospital. I looked around the parking area, and then the nearby streets. After an hour and a half, I was still wandering, with no word from the hospital of any findings in the building. I began to walk home, hoping that somehow he had remembered the way. It was a 20-minute walk. I could not imagine that he had survived in his state, let alone managed to correctly identify the entire journey home. But it was worth a shot. I arrived to find our front window smashed. No glass in the pavement below told me that somebody had broken in. Perhaps I should have been more cautious, but I just wanted to know if my husband was inside. My hand shook as I struggled to get the key into the lock. Once I did, I turned the handle and ran inside. I don't think I even closed the door behind me. "Honey, are you here?" I don't know if I was surprised to see what I saw or whether I expected this. There he was, in the bathroom, orange towel draped over his head, swaying gently. This time, a pool of blood collected on the tiled floor below, dripping from his right arm. Cuts on his legs and torso told the full story. He had no concept of pain. He smashed the window to get in, to get back to this exact spot. The injuries meant nothing to him. For whatever reason, his mind was focused only on anchoring itself in that bathroom under the gentle weight of a towel. Crying, I approached him and lifted the towel slightly. I hardly even noticed the blood soaked into it. His eyes were red. Had he even blinked since this began? The humming continued. I should have contacted emergency services immediately, but instead I just stood there. I stared into his eyes, pretending he was staring back into mine. I wanted him back. Gently, he lifted an arm and pulled the towel back down over his face. I don't know how long I stood there sobbing. "Please talk to me, I love you." The gentle humming would have been comforting, but the slight inconstancy of the rhythm was a subtle reminder that my husband had no awareness. I thought back to all our recent conversations, everything we've ever done together. Lately, he's had a fascination with the ocean. I could never understand it. A horizon swallowed by the forever swaying and crashing of waves never appealed to me. He used to tell me all sorts of facts. One that particularly disturbed me was an old tradition of placing a towel over the faces of sailors who had passed whilst at sea. Once back on the shore, you'd place a towel over their face as you waited for somebody to arrive with help or a hearse. Curiosity having a moment of breakthrough as I grieved my still-living husband, I went into the bedroom. I took a closer look at the painting. The blobs at the bottom of the lighthouse. I had always assumed them to be nondescript people, with little detail added, though I had never understood why the blobs were so colorful. Only then did I realize they were not a crowd gathering at the bottom of the lighthouse. They were dozens of bodies, laid out on the shore. Pastel-colored towels were draped over their faces. Perhaps my husband is there now, forever visiting the lighthouse, staring into the horizon as it's swallowed by the ocean. A couple of years ago, my now husband and I moved into our first home. Right off the bat, our not-so-normal home began to experience some paranormal activity. Nothing too weird, things moving around, light tapping or banging. Nothing too sinister. After a while of living together, we decided to try for a baby and were able to conceive. 9 months later, out came our daughter. Now that might sound a bit unnecessary, but the problem seemed to start when we brought her home. The first 2 nights were okay, other than a massive lack of sleep. But night 3, it got a little worse. The light apping began to get louder, more aggressive. The worst part was that we started hearing it more on her baby monitor, rather than anywhere in our house. When we'd hear it, we'd watch for a few moments, only to realize that her eyes were open. She wasn't crying, she wasn't fussing. She was just awake, looking around. The scariest part was when she looked up at what was the ceiling and just seemed to start smiling. To this day, we don't know what she was looking at. We were just happy that she was okay. All right. Now, bear with me. No, the title isn't misleading. I just needed to start from the beginning. My daughter is now 6, and the problems seem to re-escalate. From banging on the walls, throwing things around. My daughter even told me that she has heard scratching coming from under her bed and in her closet. There's just one factor that I just can't shake, and that's the fact that she doesn't seem scared or worried. Recently, she's been sitting on the edge of the basement stairs, talking to nothing but darkness. When she spots me, she just looks up and smiles. My most vivid memory of this happened just last night. I was getting her ready for bed, and while I was grabbing her before bed, snack and drink, she was right behind me. When I turned around, she wasn't there. Insert creepy child whispering. I set her snack and drink down on our island, and when I went around the corner, there she was, whispering into the abyss. I got closer to her, and among her whispering, I could have sworn I heard something whispering back. Normally, my daughter turns around upon hearing me approach, but this time, it was as if I no longer existed. "I think you're starting to scare my mama," she whispered. No shit, I was scared. The second I put my hand on her shoulder, she jerked her little head back towards me. That was the first time I saw fear into her eyes. It soon relaxed when I pulled her up and shut the door. I still don't know why she looked at me so frightened. I hadn't meant to scare her, nor did I expect the reaction. During this time, my husband was a month into his work trip, 3 states away. I decided to test something out and asked my mom to look after her for a night or 2. Though hesitant, she agreed and took my daughter in for a few nights. Within these 2 nights, I decided to experiment. I noticed that while I slept, the sounds didn't seem to appear. I even downloaded a sleep app to document whenever a sound may have been made. During the first night alone, I went downstairs for a snack, and the basement door was open. I didn't think much about it and shut it. During the second night, a similar thing happened. Only this time, when I shut the door, I heard something crash downstairs, run up the stairs, and begin scratching at the unlocked door. After nearly succumbing to a heart attack, I proceeded to run upstairs and call my poor husband, who was asleep. I explained the situation, and he told me to get a security camera. What he told me next was something I didn't want to hear. "Why don't you put it in the basement?" "Sure, let me just venture into the demonic basement to install a camera in order to catch what your child has been talking to in the dark." Sure enough, I ordered a security camera that same night and decided to go to sleep. By the next morning, there was a message on our answering machine, sent from my mom. She was basically telling me to come get my daughter, and that I needed to get her exorcised. Here's the transcript. I must note that some things were a bit muffled, so I had to do my best. "Hey, honey, though I had no clue why you asked me to watch your daughter for a few nights, I was thrilled to spend time with my grandchild, but I grew inaudible, her. She always spends 10 minutes before bed staring down my basement stairs, or down my hallway, or anywhere there's complete darkness, and she just talks. Once she finally goes to sleep, there's about an hour before all hell breaks loose, sure inaudible. Please come get her. I want my calm back." I felt so bad. I knew I shouldn't have put her through that, but it was better her than a complete stranger. Upon hearing the message, I rushed to get my daughter. When I finally made it to my mom's house, I found my daughter in tears, dreading going back home. She clung to me tightly and just sobbed in my arms. I felt bad at first, almost mad, wondering what my mom had done to her. My daughter, a girl who rarely felt many emotions other than happiness, was crying. But then I remembered, 2 nights earlier, she looked at me with pure terror on her face. I was furious until I heard my daughter whisper something in my ear. I couldn't tell what she said at first, so I pulled her back slightly and asked her to repeat herself. "He wouldn't let me and Nana sleep. He wants me to come home." I nearly dropped her. Thanking my mom, I rushed to put my daughter in her seat and rushed the 2 of us back home. Luckily, my security camera came, and I was able to set it up on the fireplace, pointed right at the kitchen and the basement. The moment we got home, it was like no time had passed. She was no longer sad. We had fun and I felt a little better. But like clockwork, by the time her bedtime came along, she asked for her snack and drink and went right to her spot. This time she looks up at me and says, "Don't look into the dark." By now, I'm pissing my pants. I'm dragging her to her bed, disregarding her snack, ready to call a priest. I call my husband and ask him if he can come home sooner, because I can't do this anymore. He says he's supposed to be back tomorrow by noon. Little did I know that putting her to bed would be such a dumb mistake. This time the banging was right outside my door. It was loud. I thought I heard screaming, but the adrenaline made my head feel light, and the second I laid down, I passed out. The next day, I refused to leave my room until my husband got home. I let my daughter come into my room, and we spent the time watching TV. When he finally got home, I insisted we look over the footage from last night. I didn't know we'd see exactly what was in the basement. When we looked over the footage, I saw that our daughter had gotten out of her bed and went to sit in her usual spot. What came from the darkness was purely terrifying. It looked like a figure, almost human-like. It had black holes for eyes. It looked skinned, yet it had patches of skin around some spots. I watched as the 2 talked. I skipped through a bit until I see her nod and walk toward the camera, pushing it downwards. It stayed that way until we fixed it this afternoon. Since then, we've moved, and haven't really had any experiences lately. At least nothing like that. I don't know what it was I saw, but to this day, I refuse to look into any little bits of darkness. I refuse to go into any basement. And I refuse to let my daughter sit in complete darkness alone. She's in her teens now, and doesn't seem to have any recollection of this ever happening. I just need answers. What was talking to my daughter? Is there a possibility of it ever coming back? Please help me. I just got home from my shift at work, and after being an avid reader here, my first thought was to post what happened tonight. I have no idea who else I could speak about this to anyway. They'd think I was telling them a story, but I'm not. I'm sorry if I make any spelling mistakes. My fingers are shaking against the keyboard. When I arrived at work 8 hours ago, I was introduced to a new staff member named Pete. We shook hands and said hello, nothing out of the ordinary. Tonight, I was going to be on waiting tables as usual. Our regular staff were all there. Kevin, our chef, Sarah, and Mason were working at the bar, and my boss Gerald was at the door. The new guy, Pete, was our new security. That did surprise me a bit. He was shorter than me and didn't look like much. But hey, these days you don't know who trains in jiu-jitsu or any other form of self-defense. Gerald had let me know after a few incidents we had at work with drunk customers that he was looking into getting someone in. It was a normal night at work for the first few hours. We get our larger crowds usually start coming in after 10 p.m. And per normal, they did. By 10:30 p.m., the bar was packed out, and I think they must have been making a killing because Sarah and Mason were in good spirits, and Gerald was smiling in his spot at the door. I started smiling too, because it was time for my cigarette break. I only take one 15-minute break in my shifts. I prefer to get paid through my break. Out the front, I noticed how busy the streets were. Cars coming back and forth. All sorts of people were out tonight, walking the strip. I set my cigarette ablaze with the timeless charm of a matchstick waltz. And boy, when I breathed that sucker in, I felt myself dancing on the spot. Yeah, it was time to quit these little shits. But the nicotine was gripped away from my lungs as a juxtaposition to my awareness, being pulled to the noise at the front of our bar. I counted 4 guys eyeing up Pete. They did not look happy. I could hear yelling, but I wasn't sure what they were saying. I couldn't fight, but I walked towards the crowd. Pete was new to the crew, but hey, he was one of us, so maybe I could ease the situation. It became clear what was going on. The biggest guy said, "You bro, let us in. We've only had a few." His friend next to him spat out, "We'll go in anyway. What are you gonna do?" That's when things changed from just talk to physical. Pete took a step toward the group. Then they pounced on him. It was a roaring sea of fists and elbows. Pete disappeared beneath the bodies. I began to yell out for them to stop, but it continued. Gerald appeared from the front door of the bar with his baseball bat, calling for an end to the ruckus. One by one, the men stood up and backtracked. "Get Pete out the back and get some ice on him," Gerald ordered me. Pete sat down next to the freezer and I grabbed the ice. "Pass it here, brother," he asked. Pete placed the ice over both of his eyes for a full minute. During that time, I tried to explain to him that I came straight over to the incident, but by the time I got there, Gerald was already there with the bat. "No problems, bro. You did what you could." "Sorry, man. I should have moved faster, but I didn't know what to do." That's when Pete pulled away the ice. Nothing, not a mark, not a scratch. I couldn't believe my eyes. I know the force of the punches that were being thrown down on him. Maybe he had been able to cover up the whole time, but I doubted it. Pete passed me the ice back and made his way back out to the front. How the hell was this guy still walking? The rest of the night was normal except for the main thought in my mind, twirling back and forth over what had happened to Pete and how he looked the same as when I met him that evening. The next few hours ticked by until everyone began to leave at close-up. We didn't have too much to clean up, luckily, so we would be able to shoot home not long after. Sarah and Mason took off first after cleaning up the rest of the mess in the bar. Kevin, who I hadn't seen much of this shift, had already jumped on his bike and melted into the night. That's when Gerald took Pete and me out the front of the building. Pulling out 3 cigars, he thanked us both for sorting out the trouble that came to the bar tonight. Although, I don't know why he thanked me. We all stood there in silence. I'm sure all of us were relieved at what was the end of an adventurous night at work. "What's up, A voice called out from the other side of the road. The same 4 guys emerged from their car. But now there was another car with them, and another 3 guys jumped out, 2 of them carrying their own bats. But one of them had a gun. I felt my body freeze in fear. I wasn't one for confrontation. But a gun? I was a statue of anxiety. The collective advanced in our direction, a looming presence growing larger with every step. But before my fear could even imagine what would happen, the sound of 2 gunshots filled up the night. Pete dropped to the floor. The men scurried to their cars and sped off. I was the first to move. I placed my hands over the holes in Pete's shirt that sat over where his heart was. Gerald instantly ran inside to call 911. I was sweating like a track runner. Then I puked my guts out, but I still pressed on over the wounds, until I felt my will leaving me. I passed out. I woke up to the sound of sirens in the air. Once I was sat up by the paramedics, the cops were instantly asking me all sorts of questions, asking me what had gone on and where my friend was. I told them that Gerald was inside making sure we had help coming, but it wasn't Gerald they were asking about. They were asking for Pete, and he was nowhere to be found. Once I came to properly, The cops pointed out that there was no blood anywhere near the supposed fight scene or where Pete had lay shot. I couldn't explain any of it. Neither could Gerald. I was in shock and felt lost in my thinking. But now, as I'm sitting at home writing this, a news alert has jumped onto the TV. 2 cars about 5 miles from our bar had been wrecked in an accident.